Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking all things defense, including targets, tiers, and strategy so that you can find exactly what you need in your draft. Now you'll remember that rule number 2 of the data draft strategy is to draft 2 elite power play quarterback defensemen, and at different points during the year I suggested getting both by the end of the 6th round. But with the depth and at the defensive position this year and the tandem power play quarterback options this year, that approach may not be exactly what we're looking for. But to understand how we'll adjust, let's first look at some data. So what you're looking at here was pulled from my 22-23 season recap on defense, where I looked at the end rank and the ADP and tried to figure out how things fell by the end of the year. So if you want more detail, check out that video in the 22-23 season recap playlist on my channel. But the first takeaway here is that 8 of the first 10D drafted were relatively disappointing. Now, disappointing is basically measured by anything minus 15 or over than that. So all of these guys up to Drew Doughty were disappointing except for Mo Sider, and he started slow. He didn't put up a lot of points in the first half, but he was giving you hits and blocks, and then eventually the points started to come. So he actually held up his end of the bargain at 45, and I thought he was getting drafted higher than that last year, but apparently not. And he did actually hold up his value there, so he might be a nice, safe play with a high floor this year. Now, of these guys, some of these guys, missed time. Cale Makar would have been a lot higher. He wouldn't have been disappointing because when he was in the lineup, he was a top 4-3 defenseman in fantasy. Victor Hedman lost his PP1 spot to Sergachev. Adam Fox routinely gets overdrafted. Yossi didn't regress all that much. That's still a nice defenseman to have on your team. Ekblad has regressed and lost his spot to Montour. Then you have Quinn Hughes. Letang missed some time. Devon Taves is not a power play 1 quarterback. 1 Makar's in the lineup. So a lot of these guys have some elements baked in, but a lot of these guys are just things that maybe you couldn't have seen Sergachev overtaking Hedman, but some of these guys are overdrafted. Fox, Quinn Hughes, guys that are very assist and power play heavy, and so they don't hold up their end of the bargain by the end of the year, depending on your league format. This is for a categories league with standard offensive categories plus hits and blocks. So you're looking at a lot of regression in the top 10, but you're also looking at the optimal place to start drafting D is right at that cutoff line. So this is around the 7th round in a 12-team league, and everybody under this is relatively okay. Now, with that said, the only disappointing D below that cutoff are Uyghur, Bouchard, D'Angelo, Hannafin, and Spurgeon. And until Bouchard got PP1, all of those guys would have been pretty unassuming, and you wouldn't have necessarily built your team around those guys. So it's not something that's going to kill your team. You don't want to make that mistake drafting these disappointing guys early in the draft because that could hurt you. Now, it didn't necessarily hurt you if you had certain players on this list, guys like Makar and Yossi. They were not necessarily disappointing in that they were excellent when they were in your lineup. But if you make a mistake down here, it's not going to kill you. You can find something on the waiver wire. But this is a little bit of what you can take away from the defenseman change sorted by ADP. But what if we sort it by end rank? So this is how things ended up at the end of the year. Only one of these guys, Yossi, was drafted in that top 7-round range or whatever. Most Sider's obviously up there as well. But everybody above this 100 or whatever this D10 is, was improved or relatively similar. Now, the relatively similar cutoff was -15. Yossi's -19. We're kind of splitting hairs there. It was a relatively arbitrary number. It was basically suggesting that you could have drafted them 2 rounds later or thereabouts. So all of these guys improved. Now, 9 of the top 10D were improved by that metric. I'm going to say that, obviously, Mo Sider, I put as relatively similar. He's, pretty much held up his end of the bargain. He didn't improve necessarily, but he did technically improve. So 9 of the top 10 were improved, but also only 2 of those 9 were drafted earlier than the 7th round, as I just mentioned, Yossi and Sider. So they may be some safe options for this season. And then only 4 defensemen in the top 200 weren't drafted at all. And that's Adam Larson, Braden McNabb, Andrew Peak, and Jake Sanderson. So Sanderson kind of came out of nowhere as a rookie. If you like drafting rookies, you probably were all on top of that. Larson made a nice pairing with Vince Dunn, so he actually kind of built his value on his hits and blocks, and then got some offensive production from that. But A lot of these guys were improved, but you do have to draft them. You can't necessarily count on your D2 or D3 coming off the waiver wire because only 4 of the top 200 weren't drafted at all. So there's some takeaways from last season's analysis. And let's look at point per game distribution now. This is where most of the D are lying in this box plot here or within these quartile ranges. And then all of these guys are kind of exceptional. And you can see how exceptional Erik Karlsson was last year. Over 1.1 points per game, closer to 1.2 points per game than he was 1.1. Cale Makar is one of the few guys who can go over a point per game. So of the defensemen in the league right now, the guys who can go over a point per game are Karlsson, Makar, Josi, and maybe 2 or 3 other guys that have gotten within, you know, a stone's throw of 1 point per game. Guys like Fox have gotten there. A couple of other guys that I mentioned last year. So looking at it now, you have Quinn Hughes, Josh Morrissey. They had excellent years. Morrissey's a little bit more complete than Quinn Hughes. Dahlin is, you know, not that far behind, probably in that 0.9 range. Heiskanen right beneath him. Then you have Brandon Montour. This is a forward Sebastian Aho. There's obviously 2 Sebastian Ahos. This fell through the cracks of my validation efforts, so this is a forward. You can kind of remove that. Adam Fox is very assist heavy, very power play heavy, but he is a guy who can get to close to a point per game. Dougie Hamilton's going to be a nice option because he also factors in on the goal per game distribution. So here you see the same type of thing. Most D are in this range, but then you're looking at the exceptional guys. So Karlsson, obviously not just a good point producer, but a goal scorer. And I noticed that in the second half video last year. So before the draft, I looked at the second half of the previous season and saw that Erik Karlsson was actually scoring at a 20 goal per season pace for an 82 game season. And I started recommending that you go out and draft him. I wasn't banging the drum saying that you should because there's obvious risk there, but if you did draft him, it made out like a bandit for you. So he's a very offensively powerful defenseman to own, especially for the fact that he does get some goal scoring in there. Cale Makar, another excellent goal scorer as well. Then you have Dougie Hamilton and Roman Josi. So these are the elite of the elite because they're all in and around a point per game or above, and they're heavy goal scorers. Now, some interesting names down here. Bowen Byram. Very complete player. He was a 75 on the completeness rankings, which is very good, especially for a guy who doesn't get a lot of power play time. And he does score goals with some of the best of them in the league. Zach Werenski's a guy who's a 3-shot per game guy, and he's hit 20 goals in his career before in only 65 games, if I'm not mistaken. So to have Bowen Byram ahead of him last year in goals per game is exceptional. Then you have my, one of my go-tos, John Carlson. He's in this range as well. Brady Shea's kind of a surprise there. Brent Burns isn't. And then you have Simon Edvinsson. Now, it's only a 9-game sample size, but he did have 2 goals in those 9 games. I wonder if that's just a starter kit for him. Hopefully he makes the team this year and plays full-time minutes, and then we'll have to wait and see how that pans out because they do have a lot of mouths to feed in terms of the power play with Gostisbehere and Sider there, so I don't know if he'll get the power play time, but these are some goal-scoring options, a couple of unique names, a couple of deeper names for you, some keeper league plays in Byram and Edvinsson, and then a couple of older names that might fall through the cracks like John Carlson, Brent Burns, Zach Werenski, guys you can have in the back of your mind for your draft. But there's one other element to a defenseman that you want to pay attention to, and that's power play points. So this is power play point distribution. This graph is pretty cool. I just found out that you could do this today, so I cooked this up earlier today. This is the guys with the names here are the top 15. So a couple of interesting files in here. Obviously, you're going to see the usual suspects. Now, Chris Letang may or may not keep this power play unit. Between him and Karlsson, it's going to be, I don't know if they're going to use both of them, but the thing to keep in mind is both of them are 1 injury away from the other guy taking power play 1. So if you're, judging between the two, I would, try to go for Chris Letang later because he's going to give you that floor where he's getting hits and blocks consistently. He's a very consistent and complete player in fantasy. And then if Karlsson goes down with injury, he's also the power play 1 quarterback, and you drafted him super late. Karlsson's going to get overdrafted this year, or at least, drafted relative to what his value was last year. I would expect Karlsson to be in and around the 80-point range. So that could be a regression from what he did last year, but he's still going to be good for you. There's a couple of interesting names here. Ty Smith, that's a small sample size. And last year, when Chris Letang went down with injury, they also had Jeff Petrie go down with injury. And so Ty Smith was called up, and he quarterbacked the power play and did really well there. So if you're in a keeper league, if you're looking for some really deep league plays, I don't know if Smith even makes the team this year. He's had trouble trying to crack the lineup, and he's not penciled in the top 6 defensemen right now. But if he does, he could be an interesting option. I wouldn't necessarily count on him for power play point production going forward. That was injury related, and that's why he's on this list. But he was still top 15 in power play points per game because of that opportunity that he got. But let's break it down a little bit further, because there's only a couple of guys that are power play quarterback #1, and they're locked in there. And this is the list. So sorted by final weighted rankings on my 23-24 weighted rankings sheet. Cale Makar, obviously #1. Yossi, Dahlin, Hamilton, Morrissey, John Carlson, Heiskanen, Fox. Now you're getting into this range where you're looking mainly at assist-heavy power play defensemen like Fox, Hughes. Then you get Mike Matheson, who's relatively complete but didn't play a full season last year. You get Zach Werenski, who's coming off of an injury. He's a very high shot volume guy, a goal scorer, and was doing a little bit of everything for Columbus, and then he goes down and their season continues to collapse, I guess. It wasn't really going well before that. Vince Dunn is an interesting candidate because they didn't have a great power play. I think it was 19th in the NHL last year, and they had the second highest shooting percentage in the league. So there's potential regression baked in for Seattle in general, but he is one of, if not the main power play quarterback guy. The question is, are they going to use Justin Schultz there at all? They did a little bit last year, but then Vince Dunn kind of took it and ran with it. So that'll be interesting to see in preseason. You have Noah Dobson, who's definitely locked in on that power play 1 in Long Island, but how good is their power play? Have they done anything to improve? Because I don't see any additions to their lineup, and they have the same coach and everything's the same. Seth Jones could be an interesting play here because he's a very good hits and blocks D, so he's going to give you a nice floor. And then he's also going to be quarterbacking that power play with Connor Bedard, which you may want access to. So he's probably not going to be drafted all that high. I don't have his ADP off the top of my head, but you can check it on the 23-24 weighted rankings dashboard in the Patreon link in the description below. Or you can just check it on Yahoo or ESPN, whatever your league is. But the guy that I'm most excited about this year off of this list is Evan Bouchard, because last year, this ranking is based off of the fact that most of the season he was not power play quarterback #1. It was Barry, and then they trade Barry for Ekholm, and then Evan Bouchard takes the power play over, and he's essentially, I think he had 18 points in the power play. I'm sorry, 16 power play points, 18 total points in the playoffs last year, and he was well over a point per game after the trade deadline. So he's a guy that you're definitely going to want to have access to with McDavid, with Draisaitl, that whole power play, which is historic. I think they're over 35% last year. Could be wrong about that, but there was points where they were close to 50% for the first month or so of the season. So this is definitely a power play you want access to. I just don't know where he's going to get drafted. If he's being drafted within the 3rd or 4th round range, that's probably where he should go. If he goes anything later than that, he's going to be incredible value for you. As far as I know, he's a very high shot volume guy. I'd have to double check that just to make sure, because some of that, again, is without power play time. But he is one of those guys I'm keeping my eye on. And then a really deep league play is Cam York. Now, I don't know exactly who's going to be quarterbacking the power play in Philadelphia, but he was doing a lot of that towards the end of the year, and he looked really good, just eye test last year. So they should be an improved team, getting Couturier back, getting Cam Atkinson back. They've got rising stars in Tippett and Noah Cates. They still have Konechny, who's probably going to get some power play time. They do have some pieces to work with on that power play, and if he's quarterbacking it and nobody's thinking about him, he could be a nice play for you. But this is basically all of the guys that are uncontested on power play 1. But let's take a look at the guys who may have a timeshare, and those would be your D2 and D3 targets. So some of these guys are going to be a little bit more appealing than others. The guys in green are the guys who had better seasons last year. Montour's starting the year injured, so that could factor into it. Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson, we mentioned before about the power play usage. Sergachev and Hedman, it's just a guessing game as to which one of them is going to run with the power play. But if you think about fading Hedman because you think Sergachev got the power play, all it takes is one 5 or 10 game stretch where they don't click, and the power play goes back to Hedman. So if you're really fading Hedman for that reason, you might as well scoop him up in the 6th, 7th, 8th round range, because he is one of those guys that was around a point per game player or over a point per game. Just a couple, I think it was last year he was a point per game player. So He's one of those guys with the high ceiling. If he is the power play quarterback, he's getting you elite level exposure to Kucherov and Stamkos and Point and all those other guys that you do want access to. And then there's some others on here who are a little bit unassuming. So Sean Durzee's a nice little play here if he's the power play quarterback in Arizona. J.J. Moser did a little bit of that earlier in the season last year, and he was pretty good at it. But if it's Sean Durzee, he's relatively proficient at power play usage statistics, and he could potentially bump your value if you're getting him really late in the draft because nobody's really paying attention to that. But Arizona's improved. They might have a guy like Dylan Guenther, firing the puck on the power play. Zucker maybe in front of the net, screening the goaltender, which could open up some things for him. But there's some other options on here as well. Jamie Drysdale might get forgotten about. He was a power play quarterback before he went injured last year. I do know that they love Cam Fowler. He's a pretty complete defenseman in real life. In fantasy, he's kind of a waiver wire pickup for me in a 12-team league. But there are some other options as well. I don't know who's going to get the power play in Boston, McAvoy, Lindholm, but if you're going to fade one for the other, you might as well target one of them in that mid-round range. And the reason why these are D2, D3 targets is in the past, you had a relatively small list of elite level guys, and you do want one of those guys on this list. So you want to have one of these guys minimum on your team as your PP1 QB offensive defenseman who's going to boost your offensive rankings. But then for your D2 and D3, what I would do is try to find two of these guys, because essentially you're one bad stretch or one injury away from your guy taking over power play 1. And of these guys, I would go for the guys with the highest floor. So Sergachev hits and blocks, that would be a good option. Morgan Riley's relatively consistent. If he loses the power play to Klingberg, I don't know if it makes Klingberg all that more valuable because he's a power play specialist, assist heavy. He doesn't do a whole lot of anything else. Pietrangelo and Theodore are always consistent in this range, 59, 62. They're all kind of, interchangeable in that one guy could run the power play. The other guy could run it, who, it doesn't really matter. Then you have Torrey Krug, Justin Falk, same type of thing in St. Louis with those two guys. Both of them are pretty effective on the power play in stretches. Justin Falk, a little bit more of a goal scorer with some shot volume. The Ottawa situation is intriguing because you could go with any of these guys, and if any of these three guys are the power play 1 quarterback, they're probably going to be drafted relatively high. But if the other two aren't drafted high, you could get some excellent value. Jacob Chychrun is a shot volume guy. He hits. He does a little bit of everything. You could get him, potentially after the 100 range. If people think that Shabbat or Sanderson is going to take over the power play, it's up in the air for me right now. I don't know who they're going to have there, but you might as well look at the other guys and the guys with the highest floor with the most peripherals as your potential D2, D3. Speaking of some of those guys, Drew Doughty might be one of those guys. I don't know if Brant Clark is going to be ready to quarterback that power play, and if he's not, Drew Doughty could be an excellent depth option for you who's going to get hits. He's going to get some other things, and then that power play is not necessarily Edmonton, but it's still relatively proficient. They got some gunners on that team. Kevin Fiala is a good player. Kopitar's still got it going on in certain stretches, and they do have some guys that are power play specialists. Arthur Kaliev is one of those guys, kind of like a Daniel Sprong, who can score on the power play, and you're getting access to that through Drew Doughty. And then if you're in a keeper league, you just target Brant Clark for how ridiculous he was in the playoffs in the was it OHL last year. I think he had like 24 points in 12 games or something crazy like that. In terms of Florida, there's basically 4 guys to look at. I wouldn't look at Ekblad, but Montour is obviously the #1 guy, and when he comes back and is healthy, I would assume he takes that back over. In the meantime, it's either going to be OEL or Gustav Forsling, and Forsling is actually a heavy shot volume guy. So the sneaky play might be to get Gustav Forsling really late and hope that for the first month or 2 of the season, you can ride that wave and get that power play usage, get the shot volume, and then maybe flip him to somebody else and make a trade of it where you get somebody better for the second half of the season. In terms of Detroit, we talked about it a little bit. Seider versus Gostisbehere. Who knows what's going to happen there? Gostisbehere is a really good power play guy. Seider needs that power play time to become an elite #1 fantasy defenseman, but he does put up a really high floor, so that's an excellent pick. Just depends on where he goes. And then obviously Burns, heavy shot volume guy, good goal scorer. He should quarterback that power play, but Tony DeAngelo, that's his specialty. That's pretty much all he's good at. He's not very responsible defensively, so We pretty much covered everybody here, but these are who I would be targeting for D2s and D3s for that reason. If the other guy goes down, they're the power play one quarterback, and you're getting it at low risk, where you're potentially getting a high floor because you're looking at peripherals, and then you're getting access to that power play, even if it's PP2 for a little bit. Again, you're one injury away or one slow stretch away from that guy running the power play. But there are a couple of other D3 options if you wanted to go another direction. I mentioned Bowen Byram. Darnell Nurse is not going to get the power play time, but he is really good for hits and blocks. So if you're in a hits and blocks league, he's one of those guys that's really good at both. I believe he's 90th percentile or better in both. Dmitry Orlov, changing teams. I believe he's in Carolina now. So he's an interesting option just for the fact that he could cover some peripherals, and he did put up a lot of offensive numbers when he came over to Boston. Obviously, Jacob Trouba is a big hitter, shot blocker. Keandre Miller is a nice up-and-coming player in the mid-40 point range. He gets some hits, gets some blocks, and he had stretches last year where he was really impressive. If he can continue that and become a little bit more consistent, he becomes a fantasy option. Similarly, in terms of power play, Neil Pionk, Josh Morrissey's the guy who's going to run the power play, but if for whatever reason let's say Morrissey gets injured or the power play starts slumping, or if they start trading off players, maybe Neil Pionk gets a power play spot, and he does like to hit. I believe he's over a hit and a half per game. So he could be another one of those high floor, potential power play guys. Mackenzie Weegar, I would expect to bounce back this year just from everybody involved in Calgary, because they're going to be improved, in my opinion. They're going to have a more offensive mindset. And then some of these guys are kind of hit and miss. Nick Blankenberg, that's an interesting name. I'd have to look into his file, but I do believe he does shot block and hit quite a bit. And he does, I don't know what kind of opportunity he's going to get with all the additions they've made on that blue line, but some other names that you could look at. I don't think Shattenkirk's going to run the power play in Boston, but he could. He's done it before, and he is kind of a specialist there, so who knows. Adam Larson and Colton Parayko, more shot blockers, hits guys. And speaking of, that's what you would look for in terms of your D4. So these are the guys that are above 90th percentile. I think it's 85th percentile. I actually dialed it in here. 85th percentile or better in both hits and blocks. So if you have those categories, or if you're also looking for penalty minutes, some of these guys are going to be crossing over into that range as well. I mentioned Letang, but Jeff Petrie is also really good for those things as well. He's a very complete defenseman, not just last year, but the past couple years. Sider, we've gone over. Trouba, you know what you're going to get there. Pionk, same type of thing. Mackenzie Weegar is also that. He could also, I believe it's Rasmus Anderson on PP1 in Calgary, but they could potentially go Weegar there as well. Adam Larson, shot blocker, hits, same type of thing, but that regression potential for Seattle is there. Ristolainen's a big hitter and a shot blocker. He's one of those guys that's been there over the last 5 years or so in that range. And as you work your way down, you get a little bit less valuable, but a guy like Radko Gudas, I always go to for hits and blocks. He's, I believe, one of the only guys in the league, along with Ristolainen and maybe one or two other guys, that's put up an average of 4 hits per game at various points in his career. So that's something to look at. Braden McNabb is an elite shot blocker. Faravari hits and blocks as well. Hakanpää's a big hitter. You know what you're going to get here. But the reason I say D4 is the strategy should be get that elite upper echelon #1 bona fide power play quarterback that we saw in that other slide. We want one of those minimum. If you can get 2, that's great. If you can't, you get your D2 and your D3 from the previous D2, D3 list, where you can have a high floor peripherals guy that could potentially find his way onto a power play as well. Then with your 4th or 5th defensive spot, depending on how many D you get, that's where you go with your hits and blocks guy. If you're in a league with plus minus, you'd probably target a plus minus guy. Or penalty minutes league, you're going to target that guy. But that's where you get your specialty tool. The guy that's going to do 1 or 2 things at an elite level like this, where all of these guys are elite level hitters and shot blockers. And you can use the 23-24 player hub, the data draft player hub. I kind of featured it in the goaltending video in the last video, but the same exact thing exists for skaters, and you can dial it in exactly what you need in terms of hits, blocks, shots, any offensive category. All of that, you can use the sliders and find exactly what you need. And if you want access to the goaltending hub or the 23-24 player hub or any of the weighted rankings you saw in this video, you can go to the Patreon link in the description below. For $3 a month, you get access to all of those. For $5 a month, you get all of that access, as well as access to our Discord group, which is growing by the day. Everybody's coming in and they're starting to pitch in their knowledge, and everybody's getting more intelligent heading into the draft just because of the high-level hockey minds that are signing up for this Discord group. A lot of discussions going on, and we're finding out a lot through the use of mock drafts and people experimenting with different league sizes and trying to find different patterns of where guys are going. So if you want access to that, Patreon link in the description below. But that's going to do it for this video. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.